Okay, so Kiss fans, you probably know Bruce Kulick, Kiss guitarist from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s. Of course, he took over for Mark St. John after he left the band. Stayed with Kiss up until the band reunited with original members Ace Frehley and Peter Criss in 1996. And then, of course, when guitarist Frehley left the band in 2002, his slot would be filled by Tommy Thayer, who would wear his Spaceman makeup. Now, Thayer's relationship with Kiss had gone back to the 1980s when Gene Simmons had produced a couple albums for his band Black and Blue. He had a hair metal band. Gene produced a couple albums for them. And when the time came for Kiss to do their Kiss conventions in the mid-'90s, Gene called upon Tommy Thayer, who wasn't really doing much. He basically told him, hey dude, you give up on this music thing, that hair metal thing is way in the past. You're not going to make it as a musician. Let me give you a job. As basically, it started out as, I believe it was like a gopher. He was basically Gene's B.I. Itch for those Kiss conventions. And then eventually, when the band reunited with Criss and Frehley, by that point, Thayer had worked his way up to sort of I guess he was kind of an assistant tour manager or something of some sort. And by the time Frehley left the band in 2002, Thayer stepped into the costume and makeup. And of course, the story is that Thayer, after Black and Blue, had been in a Kiss tribute band. And the famous story is that when the Kiss reunited, Ace had forgotten a lot of his guitar solos from back in the day, and it was Thayer, who had been playing in that tribute band, who retaught Ace all those old solos. But today I want to talk about Bruce Kulick and some of his statements about whether or not he would have dressed up in Ace's makeup had he been approached rather than Tommy Thayer. And I want to look at it from a different kind of perspective, from someone else in the family, literally and figuratively, the Kiss family. But first, let's go back. Let's look at some of Bruce Kulick's statements he said about wearing Ace's makeup, whether or not he would have done it. Back in 2020, there's an article on blabbermouth.net, and it says, Bruce Kulick says Stanley and Simmons made the right decision having Thayer and Singer wear Spaceman and Catman makeup. And it goes on to say that he spoke with a guy named Joe E. Kramer. I don't know, that's not the guy from Aerosmith, I don't think. Somebody else. He says, I don't disagree that it's something to discuss, but I'm very, very clear in my opinion. Look, when Paul and Gene first made some lineup changes, they didn't want the new drummer, Eric Carr, God bless him, to be the cat. Eric was a tremendous player and so important in the band, but even he had a real dilemma about his makeup. And at the last minute, he goes on to say, talks about Eric's hawk costume, and then he became the fox, and then Vinnie Vincent was the Ankh. Talks about how many characters are you going to have, and then he goes on to say, and then I think they got blindsided with Ace. First, Peter all of a sudden pulls a move or something, the way I've heard the story, where they were just on tour, and Gene and Paul were like, call up Eric, Singer. We're putting him in the Catman outfit. It was like if he was behind the kit, it wouldn't matter. It doesn't matter. Eric Singer does a fantastic cat, and then by the time Tommy was always ready to step in, and he goes on to talk about Tommy being in that Kiss tribute band as well as Black and Blue, and then he says, I think Gene and Paul made the right decision, even though some fans don't like it. They're carrying on more with these iconic characters, just like the way you do merchandise and the way the face masks kind of represent something very, very powerful, and they both do it with the right respect. Now it says, according to Kulick, he was glad that he was never approached to rejoin the band and wear Ace's makeup after Fraley left for good in 2001. He says, as much as I miss being in the band, for me, if suddenly after all those 12 years of what I've done, through Asylum, Crazy Nights, Hot in the Shade, and Revenge, and all that body of work, being me, to suddenly, alright, now I'm gonna be the spaceman. That would be really weird. It would just be weird. And especially when part of what the spaceman does is rockets out of his guitar. You know what I mean. Kulick's always maintained he was glad he was never put in that position, but he doesn't say flat out, no, I wouldn't have done it. Now, does he? Now, he does say it would have been weird for him to play the spaceman, but he stops short of definitively saying no, he wouldn't have done it. Now, I want to fast forward 4 years to this next interview Bruce Kulick did, where he discusses that same topic of whether or not he would have dressed up in Ace's spaceman costume had he been asked to do so. According to UltimateGuitar.com, in July of 2024, it says, Bruce Kulick on why he wouldn't have rejoined Kiss even though he missed it. I'm not disappointed they didn't ask me. So in this interview, he comes right out and says definitively no, he would have rejected that offer. And he says, and if being part of the final shows meant I had to ask to be there, I'd rather stay home. And of course, Bruce Kulick nor any other member of the Kiss family was asked to join Kiss during those final shows of the End of the Road tour. And obviously the vibe here, Bruce Kulick felt a little bit snubbed, so maybe at this point he felt like he could come right out and say that he definitively would have said no to that offer, because at this point he knew Kiss was done. Maybe back in 2020 he might have thought there was an inkling that he might still have a chance to play with the band, so maybe he didn't want to say anything too bad about it. And as a matter of fact, this topic comes up a little bit later in the video, so stick around. But he goes on to say in this 2024 interview, he says, I've made peace with not being included in Kiss's End of the Road. That said, no, they never called me. So he felt as if he had gotten snubbed on that tour, and he says, I've always missed being in Kiss, but if being in Kiss meant being the spaceman like Tommy, I wouldn't want to do it. So he goes from saying in 2020 that it would have been weird to do it to saying he wouldn't want to do it. He says, I'm not disappointed they didn't ask me to be in Kiss again. To be in Kiss again, I would have had to be the spaceman, right? If I had done that, I would have negated my entire non-makeup era. So he feels that that would have negated all of his non-makeup contributions to Kiss. I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, a lot of the fans who were fans of that 80s era might have been, obviously would have been disappointed in him. The fans who were not keen on anyone dressing up like Ace or Peter would have, so as far as those fans were concerned, it would have negated his work in the 80s. But I don't know that I don't necessarily agree with him on that. But he does say that Tommy Thayer did a fine job playing Ace's riffs with some swagger. He did the spaceman well, but I never wanted to. So from 2020, he goes from saying it would have been weird to flat out saying he never wanted to. I kind of feel like maybe there was a little sour grapes. Maybe he was a little butt hurt not being invited to take part in those final shows. So maybe he just came out and said, F it, guy never wanted to be that spaceman anyways. And I'm not saying that he's full of S, but I just don't think it would have been that cut and dry. I don't know how he could have so cavalierly passed up an opportunity like that. I just don't think it would have been that simple. I think it would have been a gut-wrenching decision for him either way, whether or not to do it or not to do it. I think when you think about a guy, Bruce Kulick, who was blindsided, supposedly when they made that reunion, Kiss decided to do the reunion, he lost his job in Kiss. If he were suddenly to be reapproached by Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley to say, hey, Bruce, we need a new spaceman. We want you to dress up like Ace. Here's the paycheck. It's going to be X amount of dollars. I don't know what Bruce Kulick was doing at that point. Is he really going to turn that down? Now, I'm not saying that he's full of shit, but it's really hard. You put yourself in that position as a jobbing musician. If you need the money, that kind of offer, it's almost like Bruce is basically, he's doing a good job of towing the company line. In that 2020 interview anyway, where he just says it was weird and he doesn't come flat out say no, that he didn't want to do it. He's lauding Gene and Paul for carrying on with the iconic characters. He's giving homage to Tommy and Eric, and at the same time, he's expressed his respect for Ace Frehley, and Ace Frehley has expressed his respect in kind to Bruce Kulick for not, even back in the 80s, replicating Ace's solos. Bruce always had his own style. He would always kind of use those Ace solos as a template when they would play the old songs in concert, but he always made those solos his own, and Ace has always said he respect. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's kind of an FU to Tommy Thayer. We know how Ace feels about Tommy Thayer being in his makeup, but I really think that Bruce Kulick, if given the opportunity, could he have been able to say no? And I want to look at it, I've got another angle, because none other than Bob Kulick had some things to say. Bruce's brother, Bob Kulick, who most Kiss fans know auditioned for that lead guitar slot back in the early days, that same audition where Ace Frehley came in and got the job. Bob Kulick was there that day auditioning for that position, and he almost got the position. And this is what Bob Kulick had to say on a Mitch LaFon interview in 2019. I talked about this on a video I made about a year back, and he's got some very interesting things to say as it pertains to the topic we're discussing and Bruce Kulick's relationship with Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley. Of course, Bob Kulick, even though he didn't pass his original Kiss audition, did go on to do a lot of session work for Kiss, beginning with Alive 2. He worked on Paul Stanley's solo album, and he would also play guitar, co-write a lot of the material, things in the 1980s with Kiss. So his history with Kiss goes way back, and he has a big history with Kiss. So go ahead and listen to what Bob Kulick had to say about his brother Bruce. Very interesting stuff. And I'll link to the full interview in the description, but it's a fantastic interview. Bob Kulick had a lot of things to say. He had a falling out with Kiss, leading him to being uninvited from the Kiss cruise. Now, he had played on a 2018 Kiss cruise, and his performance was so successful, playing some of the songs, the Kiss songs he'd been involved in, songs like Naked City, that he says he was offered to do a record and to do a tour with his brother Bruce Kulick, who you all know later joined Kiss in the 1980s. He was offered to do a Kulick Brothers tour, but apparently Bruce turned the offer down. Now, this actually was a big source of tension between Bob and Bruce Kulick. The idea was for them to put a band together and play all those Kiss songs that Bruce and Bob had been involved in.
The frustration really started from that Kiss show. where we opened the proceedings after the band did their acoustic Sail Away show. Bruce, myself, the band that I put together, Brent Fitz and Todd Kearns, with no rehearsal, got up there and, well, you heard it. Everybody heard it. What that told me was that this should be a band and that everybody should stop what they're doing and try one more time to see if this would work. Brent and Todd were open for it. My brother was not open for it. I had offers for records. I had offers for tours that I had to turn down. I wanted to get back out and play, and I thought playing this catalog would be something great because of the response from that night.
And he did say that his relationship with his brother Bruce changed after Bruce joined Kiss, citing Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley as being a bad influence. They were a bad influence with regards to how to treat people.
After my brother joined Kiss, there was a discernible change in his attitude towards me. And I blame Paul and Gene for setting bad examples for how to treat people. I'm just being honest.
He said Bruce was nothing more than a replacement guitarist who was following in his footsteps. And he said that Bruce had been quote unquote kissed and that he still worshiped Gene and Paul.
My brother was a replacement guitar player. He replaced somebody in Kiss. He replaced somebody in Grand Funk Railroad. I actually worked with Mark Farner and did his solo record. And I actually worked with Kiss first. He's kind of just following my footsteps. And I'm very happy for him that he's got a gig in Grand Funk. But I realized that he's been kissed and he's not going to change. He still worships Paul and Gene, even though, what is it now? What is it? Begging to try to play on their end of the road tour? I don't get it.
So some fascinating stuff here. Now, obviously, Bob Kulick sounds like he might have been a bit bitter here. So maybe take what he said with a grain of salt. But it's interesting that this blabbermouth interview with Bruce Kulick came about 5 months after the passing of Bob Kulick. God rest his soul. But I think it's pretty funny. He's basically talking about how Bruce Kulick was up the you-know-what of Gene and Paul, that he worshipped them. So my guess is, if not, he would have had to have given it some serious consideration had the offer been presented to him. The offer to put on Ace's makeup and costume and portray the spaceman in Kiss. So for anybody out there who thinks that it would have been a slam dunk, that Bruce Kulick would have stuck to his guns and stuck to his musical integrity and not taken that gig, I don't think so, man. And this isn't meant to be a hit piece on Bruce Kulick at all. I like Bruce Kulick. I think he did great work with Kiss in the 80s, but it's fun to talk about this stuff. Kiss fans, we like to talk about, speculate about stuff ad nauseum. That's just what we do because it's interesting. So I'm not trying to slam Bruce Kulick at all, but it's kind of fascinating to think that here Bob Kulick talking about how he had some bitterness. They were offered to do this tour together as the Kulick brothers. Bruce turned it down, and that Gene and Paul were a bad influence on him. Imagine that, Gene and Paul being a bad influence on anybody. I can't imagine that. Gene and Paul are such fine individuals. Why would they be nothing but a positive influence on anybody? But interesting stuff. Bruce Kulick, my opinion, had he been offered the role of Ace Frehley's spaceman, costume and makeup, after the departure of Ace, I'm not saying that he would have turned it down. I think there's a strong possibility that we could have seen Bruce Kulick had it not been for Tommy Thayer. Bruce in that spaceman costume and makeup. But it's pure conjecture. It's speculation, rumor, and innuendo, which we don't deal with on this channel. Of course not. But that's the video. Let me know what you think in the comments discussed hitherto. If you want to slam me because you think I'm being unfair to Bruce Kulick, which I don't think I am. It's not a hit piece at all. Or do you think he would have done it? Or do you think he would have flat out said no? Let me know what you think. As always, Hope you dug it, man, and we'll see you next time.
Who's here?